Today, what I'm going to do is go through the 10 best political podcasts I would recommend to my students to help them with current examples and analysis when it comes to writing essays. Now, I'm going to go through a number of UK podcasts that I recommend, global podcasts, as well as US podcasts. If you do not study global politics, you can skip the timeline to the US. If you study global politics and you don't need to listen to US politics, then you can stop after global. But as we go along, I will explain why I believe this podcast is a good podcast. Now, my name is Jal Patel and I'm the editor of alevelpolitics.com. One very quick thing to say, if you want a good newsletter that explains the week's news in the context of A-level politics, then I think the best place to go is my Substack news bulletin. I've got thousands of students who subscribe to that. And I think it's very useful. And students say to me every year that it was an invaluable source when it came to accessing current examples. So do access that. I also put up on there my webinars that I hold on a very regular basis, and I advertise my revision conferences. So it's a good place for you to keep up to date with political events as well as some of the activities that I'm up to. So let's look at some news podcasts. Now, the best UK podcast I would recommend is The News Agents. The News Agents is a fairly new podcast. It's been going for a couple of months. The good thing about The News Agents is it brings together UK politics mostly, although they do have some global politics. And these three very seasoned journalists are able to explain those examples with a lot of sophisticated analysis. It's very approachable. Students can access this podcast very easily. And it's available on the Global Player app as well as all other apps like Spotify and Apple. I would suggest that if there's one podcast you want to listen to for UK politics in particular, it's really The News Agents. There's a lot of good analysis in that podcast. Right. The second podcast I would like to recommend is Week in Westminster. It's a Radio 4 news program that's converted into a podcast. You can access it, as I said, on all podcast platforms. In fact, all of these podcasts you can access on Apple or Spotify. The great thing about Week in Westminster is that it's led by political journalists or political editors. And every week, one political editor will look at what's happening in Parliament. So as the parliamentary session matures, you will get seasoned journalists talk about what's happened at Westminster in the past week. It's a good place to go to for parliamentary news, and I find it very useful to bring examples. Often what I do in class is I get students to listen to snippets of it because there may be a really good parliamentary debate that's worth being aware of. So I think Week in Westminster it's a weekly podcast. It's worth downloading that onto your podcast device. Political Thinking from the BBC is also very good. Now, Political Thinking tends to not focus on more immediate news. It tends to take a more broader or more in-depth analysis of one particular politician or political figure. So what Nick Robinson does is he interviews an individual and tries to appreciate that individual and their motivations and what they believe in. I think it's a very fascinating podcast. If you go back to some of previous interviews, for example, with Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, at the time of listening, she may not be Prime Minister, by the way. It's interesting to explore what makes these politicians tick. And I suppose that helps when it comes to writing politics essays, because if you can try to connect these politicians with different strands of thinking within their parties, that would enable you to get higher order analysis. If you can say, for example, that Liz Truss is a Thatcherite, or that, I don't know, Jeremy Hunt is a One Nation conservative, then it will help improve the quality of your essays. Right. Let's talk about another podcast. This particular podcast isn't a mainstream podcast, but I quite like it. It's, again, a political interview podcast. It's by a slightly irritating guy, Matt Forde, who's a comedian. So he's got a comedic look at politics, but he does get some really good interviews. I mean, very recently, there was an interview with an ex-cabinet minister within the Thatcher cabinet. And it was really interesting to see how Margaret Thatcher was able to bring together the different divisions within her party, within her cabinet. I often get students to listen to that particular interview when we're exploring how prime ministers handle cabinets, as well as when we explore in political parties the different factions that exist within political parties. So Matt Forde is a go-to place for good quality political interviews. Now, moving on to global. GPS by Forde Zakaria is really the go-to global podcast. He is the primary political commentator in the United States scene, and he normally gets onto his show prime ministers and presidents and secretaries of state and foreign ministers and economists. Forde has written a number of really interesting books as well. But for global politics, I think this is the weekly podcast that you should listen to. It comes out on a Sunday. It actually is a TV show which is converted into an audio podcast. I would listen to this. If you study global politics, it's a great comprehensive podcast which gives you some interesting takes on the week's events. Now, Forde Zakaria also gives his analysis at the very beginning, and I often find his analysis really helps students in understanding why something has happened in global politics or what's behind a particular scenario or a particular issue. For example, recently he's had some really good interviews as well as some really interesting perspectives on the Ukraine crisis. So I think GPS is a good global, all-round global podcast that you should listen to. A daily podcast that I listen to every day, it's a daily podcast, is The Intelligence from The Economist. Now, The Economist has some excellent journalism, and what they tend to do is they tend to pick the 3 most interesting stories of the day, and they explore those stories with their journalists. It's, again, very accessible for students, and it's actually edited very well. I recommended this podcast to a number of students, and they came back to me and said, they really appreciated it, and they liked it partly because, it wasn't just sort of a talking heads podcast. It has a documentary feel to it. So I think you're going to like it. The Intelligence, again, is a global podcast, but it does pick up on UK as well as US stories. So again, that's one of my picks. And finally, for global politics, the Rachman Review. Gideon Rachman is a seasoned Financial Times journalist. And again, it's an interview show. He interviews some very bright guests. And Gideon Rachman, of course, has a good grasp of political events. He wrote a very good book called Easternization, the idea of the world moving eastwards. And I think it's a trend that is explored in his show as well. And lastly, actually, for global politics, The World Next Week. It's a great all-round weekly podcast. It's from the Council for Foreign Relations, so that's a very important think tank in the United States. And they explore within half an hour the events that are going to happen in the week to come. I often find that I've missed something. There's a global event, there's a meeting, there's a G7 summit, which I haven't really followed. And they explore what may come out of those events. So it sort of equips you for the news week ahead. Now let's move on to US podcasts. The number one podcast to listen to for US politics is probably the BBC's Americast. This podcast has been going for some time, but this particular podcast gives you the analysis and understanding of US politics. Now, a lot of students find accessing US politics news in particular quite difficult because often internal US politics news isn't on the TV. You normally find it in newspapers like the New York Times, for example. Well, Americast addresses things like Congress and how Congress is functioning, elections that are going to come up. It talks about some of the big issues in the American domestic scene, as well as the key players. Now, I use it to keep abreast of US politics because the journalists actually are British journalists who are either based in the US or they visit the US on a very regular basis. And what they do is they don't just take it for granted that listeners would understand the details of US politics. So they would, for example, talk about how Congress works, and they would take a step back and talk about the way in which votes are cast in US elections. So again, that's very useful for a A-level politics student who's trying to work out how US politics works. Simon Marks does these very regular news broadcasts. They're only sometimes 5 minutes long, and he gives a very good summary of what's happening in US political events. He does this weekly show for LBC, which is also on the podcast. It comes out every Friday, American Week, and it's so great. It's a great journalistic piece. In 15 minutes, he whizzes through what's happened in that week in US politics. He lives in the United States, although he's British. So again, you get a British perspective on US politics. And that's it. These are my 10 go-to podcasts that I listen to on a weekly basis to get an understanding of global, US, as well as UK politics. I would like your recommendations. If you've got podcasts that you listen to and you would like to recommend to other students, please put it in the comments below. And please do remember to subscribe to this podcast. My thank you to the 150 students and teachers who have already subscribed to my new YouTube channel. I hope you found this useful, and I really do hope you do listen to some of these podcasts. Again, do tell me how you get on.